For my Capstone Integrative Studies thesis topic, I have chosen American Education and the Middle Class. Before moving on to our introduction, I would like to quickly note exactly what my topic is about. As America has bridged that gap between the rich and the poor in the education sector, it has been obvious that they've overlooked the middle class in their decision. With limited resources being distributed to those with low income and pay for education opportunities being an investment only limited to wealthier families, where exactly does that leave the middle class? That is the question I wanted to ask when performing my research. The disciplines I used in my research are organizational leadership and studies in personal finance. And I chose those two because organizational leadership can really take a look at those from federal to state to local government and what kind of policy changes they could implement to help bridge the gap that we have in the education system. I chose studies in personal finance because financial literacy is paramount to climbing out of lower income social statuses and moving into higher ones. And I'm actually surprised that studies in personal finance is not offered at more institutions, or that financial literacy courses are not offered at the high school level. There may be some schools that offer these, like Texas Tech offering studies in personal finance, but it's not something that's truly offered across the board. What we will cover during the course of this presentation is how we might go about improving education. We'll do a quick literature review going over the disciplines I used in my research and how they are relevant to the research, and some recommendations for change. And before moving on, I would like to quickly note that local governments, in collaboration with state governments, have truly neglected their primary role in the education system. It is something that we should really address so that we can even out education across the board. So first, let's discuss the importance of education. Those of us who are taking the class right now have seen the importance of education. It's why we're here. It's why many of us may continue on to graduate school. Education is closely linked to economic prosperity, but not just economic prosperity, financial stability as well. The erosion of the middle class is increasing that distance between the rich and everyone else, and that distance is likely to continue unless serious improvements are made to the quality of our education. The interests of the public and the parents, they wish that their children have the best education for the best future. So all American children, whether you're an immigrant to America or you're an American-born citizen, you really want to achieve the American dream. And economic prosperity and economic stability is the American dream. You just want to have a good future for yourself and your family. And policymakers really need to focus on the nexus, that connection between education and prosperity, and they can be assured of broad public support, as a majority of Americans are convinced that a high-quality education is integral for future career success. And given the current stringent state and local budgets, there are several schools in the United States that are looking for ways of addressing our ever-declining resources. And as I mentioned previously, those limited resources are being given to lower income families. And unfortunately, the middle class are normally not able to afford those opportunities like the wealthier families, but they do not qualify for any of the limited resources that are distributed to low income families. We need to really find a way to bridge that gap. So how might we go about improving that education? It is safe to know that we are going to have to do cuts. I mean, cuts of things that they've been doing across the board already, and unfortunately, it is something that needs to be done to identify better methods and to institute reforms. So Greenstone, Looney, and Shelvin, they mentioned in a book about improving student outcomes and restoring America's education potential in 2011 about understanding those budgetary trade-offs, because it's not necessarily cuts as much as you're trading off one knowledge for another. And cuts in some areas may be necessary to prioritize the most effective means and methods of inputting knowledge. Charter schools, as we will discuss further later on, they have actually found ways to implement budgets and still continue to offer courses in the arts, even if they're offering mainly a STEM curriculum. My children, for example, attend the School of Science and Technology, but they still offer quite a few things in the arts, which is really great because I don't think we should cut those completely. Some key goals that we want to go over is helping students achieve success and providing a skilled personnel for the labor market. We can't have a boosted economy, we can't have a good labor market without laborers that are educated. So the proposal that policymakers really need to look at is a dual track approach, ones that involve both the educators and the policymakers, and they seek to identify administrative changes that should be made to improve education. A core theme throughout my entire paper is leveling the playing field, because we should have excellent education for everyone, regardless of whether they're rich, poor, middle class. It shouldn't matter. A true merit-based system will be created where the best and brightest rise to the top, not just those with the richest parents. Now, you have bright students that will come from wealthy families, but you have them in low-income families, you have them in middle-income families, but they're not all in the same system, and they're not all given those same opportunities to move on and succeed. And we need to have administrative changes that foster an environment for all of these children to move on and to succeed in life. So quickly, we'll go through a literature review that talks about the different disciplines I've used during my research. Relevant literature presents multiple factors to be considered prior to undertaking improvement of the educational system. So beforehand, I really had to look at what organizational leadership was. It emphasizes developing skills, traits, and abilities that are relevant to all sectors and organizations. Super leaders are required in the field of education. Special training in leadership should be provided for administrators and others in places of influence. This could be, all the way up to your government level, those in charge of the education sector, to your district boards, to your principals, your vice principals, all the way down to your teachers, because they all are administrators and they all foster an environment of education to our students. So leaders at all levels of education, they are the ones that are instructing and shaping our future leaders. And it is up to them to provide that quality education to all economic classes. So it was through this discipline that I really wanted to look at how these policymakers could make changes. Then I went into my studies in personal finance. And I really feel that studies in personal finance should be taught at all levels of education, including the Institute of Higher Learning. So higher education, for example, like they have here at Texas Tech, graduates should possess competency in financial matters. The youths of tomorrow should be financially equipped, and by doing so, it would counter poverty. Managing funds wisely places a person on a more extensive ground to save for school fees, purchasing a house, or paying for unforeseen events in the future, because life is unpredictable. So the financially able person is likely to break the odds of poverty in society. And this will allow for the staving off of rising consumer debt and allow for wealth building. Studies in finance could also be used when addressing specific scholarship programs for higher education. Most of those are probably implemented more at the high school level or community colleges, so that there are specialty scholarships across the board. These types of awards are paramount in the progression of our future leaders and help those in low economic areas rise out of those lower social classes. So when I was trying to go through the integration of my disciplines, I wanted to see how those in leadership roles really needed to work with budgets and funding to even out our educational opportunities. By integrating organizational leadership and studies in personal finance, we can look at a few ways that those in leadership roles can change policies and funding and other arenas of American education. So only by using an integrative approach could we really find a solution to the ever-growing gap that we have in American education system. So recommendations for change. One of the first ones I wanted to look into was unbundling educational funding. So not every child in our current system is really guaranteed to find a school that's going to fit their specific needs. And this is about goals, whether it's their career goals or if it's a student with special needs. We don't really have the proper resources to educate all American children. Especially depending on the area in which you live. We have an inadequacy of resources. So it might be great to start taking a larger look at our charter schools and increasing the charter school expenditure. Now, charter schools are publicly funded, but they function without superintendents and school boards. So they run a little differently than public schools. These schools have given more power to their administrators and their teachers, and they have found ways to design innovative learning techniques and practices with an aim of improving educational standards. And through time, charter schools have had considerable performance improvement compared to their public school counterparts. And there has been a steady rise in the number of schools. In 2009, there had been a record of approximately 4,700 charter schools across 40 states, and they provided for over 1.4 million students. The more funding charter schools get, the more opportunity they can provide for these students. And charter schools, they can gear their education towards specific fields. I mentioned previously, my children are in the School of Science and Technology. My son was just accepted into Travis Early College High School, where he will actually get his associate's degree alongside his high school diploma. Out here in San Antonio, they also offer a health careers high school and just business careers high school. There are different charter schools that aim to provide a specialized education, which is something that we really should start looking into funding more than just your standard public school. We should also talk about how charter schools funds have been beneficial in bettering and maximizing the chance of educationally equipping all citizens of the United States. This has given more opportunity for equality, and children are in a position to access proper and necessary education. Another thing we might consider is providing quality control. It's the responsibility of our administrators and policymakers to really provide that quality control of our educational resources. Scholarship programs, for example, will be ineffective if their purpose ended up becoming a means of government control over private institutions, when really they should be developing educational diversity and access to education. So having that control over our education, it needs to be more open to the public and not just limited to the few. We should also discuss abolishing double taxation. I mean, in the present system, parents are hindered from making the proper decisions on issues that are not covered under the public school system. Parents have started to move over and put kids in virtual schools, private schools, single course providers, charter schools, like we've mentioned previously. And these are great educational alternatives, but we still pay taxes on the regular public school system, regardless of whether or not our children attend a public school. So parents taking their children to course providers and charter schools are not spared those local taxes. And truthfully, it's unjust and it's unnecessarily wasteful when we could be spending that tax money and putting it towards our charter schools. So the abolishment of double taxing in the school sector would reduce the cost of education, and as a result, many middle-income groups would be able to afford quality education for their children. And this includes low-income earners as well. Unfortunately, there is always going to be problems and conflicts. During my interdisciplinary research, I did bump into the issues that we have with inequality. And the ultimate test for a comprehensive education system is whether it offers equal learning opportunities. And America is failing significantly in that test. We have a massive wastage of thousands of talented American children. And it does stem from the wounds of segregation that are still prevalent in American society. And despite how many strides that we've taken towards that, African American students are still nowhere near similar educational opportunities as their white counterparts. And a lot of that does have to do with the social status, the areas where they live, and the funding in those areas. We need to start increasing the funding and have funding be even across the board so that no matter what socially economic class you belong to, you have the same opportunities as every other social class. Some other issues of conflict. Children of the high earning group have every resource they need in learning process. Unfortunately, their counterparts in lower income or even middle income families, they don't have those same opportunities. Organizations have tried to address this by offering free assistance to low income families, but they don't provide the same opportunities to middle income families. Without those free or subsidized programs, middle-income families often miss out on extra educational opportunities altogether. So equal learning and studying cannot happen since they do not play on the same ground. So unfortunately, the education system in the United States does not counter the issue of inequality. Education is supposed to level the grounds for students to ensure they compete on the same platform. But in America, it tends to preserve the status of the highly paid and pushes humble students into obedience. So, in other words, if you have enough money to pay for all your educational opportunities, you're fairly set as long as you maintain your goals. If you come from a low-income family and you live in an area that does offer you free programs, you at least have access to extra educational resources. But the middle income, they're just kind of stuck there. They don't qualify for low-income assistance, but they can't afford to pay for any out-of-pocket education. So they end up not having any opportunity at all, depending on exactly where they live. And in most larger cities, like here in San Antonio, the middle income do get left behind. So in conclusion, we do know we need to revamp our education system. We need to allow everyone to compete fairly in school and in their careers. We need to reduce the inequality we see between social classes. We need to improve financial education, and that is critical. This Studies in Personal Finance here at Texas Tech was an amazing concentration, and it should be offered across the board at all higher institutions, and we should have financial literacy courses in high school. We need to increase charter school usage. These kids, if they started planning for their future sooner, we might actually see people climbing out of poverty sooner. We need to abolish double taxation. We need to find ways to fund our charter schools, and especially for those families who don't attend public school. So building up the education system will truly lift all boats economically in the United States.